Hi everyone, it's really great to be back and got a lot to live up to given that I've enjoyed so many amazing webinars from colleagues, friends and plant-based health professionals members. So thanks very much Rahini for the kind introduction. So I hope I can impart some valuable knowledge today that perhaps we haven't covered so far in the webinar series. And so we're going to talk about pointers and pitfalls in interpreting nutrition science. A little bit about me, you all know hopefully who I am, but my kind of main day job is as a consultant hematologist at King's College Hospital, but more recently got into learning about lifestyle medicine and plant-based nutrition. I did a PhD in cancer pharmacology, and I was actually studying the impacts of selenium on cancer cell death and its role in enhancing the impact of chemotherapy. So that was my first exposure to sort of nutritional science. You may know that I run a course at Winchester University, fully online, available globally, so do check that out. I'll give you information at the end. And I spend my free time running Plant-Based Health Professionals UK with my wonderful colleagues, and also a healthcare organisation with Dr. Laura Freeman called Plant-Based Health Online. And I've been vegan for over 8 years, and there are our websites if you want to check out more about what we do. So just to cover what I will be going through in this talk, I'm going to give you a brief review of what we know about plant-based diets and their impact on human health. And this is just a brief overview for anyone who's new to this webinar series or new to plant-based nutrition. And then I'm going to delve in a bit deeply into the reasons why I think there remains disagreement in the scientific literature. And hopefully you'll go away with some key principles in interpreting the nutrition science, which can be really quite challenging to navigate. So just as a background, I'm sure you all know this, but we have known for several years now that the major dietetic associations around the world, including the BDA, confirm that a well-planned vegan diet or plant-based diet can support healthy living in people of all ages, so from cradle to grave. And we've learned a lot about the health of vegans or those on a 100% plant-based diet through a number of cohort studies, but the most well-known and robust are the Adventist Health Study from North America and the EPIC Oxford study from here in the UK. And they're ongoing studies providing data on diet and health. And within these cohorts, about a third of the participants are lacto-ovo-vegetarian or vegan. And so some headline messages from these cohort studies include that those eating the most plant-based, so vegetarians and vegans, and specifically vegans, are more likely to be a healthy body weight, are much less likely to have type 2 diabetes, with around a 50% reduction in risk if you avoid animal flesh specifically, and then a 63% reduction in your risk of getting high blood pressure. And it's also a very effective way of treating hypertension with a plant-based diet. And you're much more likely to have a healthy cholesterol level because a plant-based diet is low in saturated fat and is mostly devoid of dietary cholesterol. And when you put all this information together with additional information from other cohort studies, the headline messages are that vegetarians, and this includes vegans in this analysis, have around a 25% reduction in the risk of getting heart disease and around a 15% reduction in the risk of cancer for vegans specifically. Another way to look at dietary information from prospective cohort studies is by using this relatively newly developed plant-based dietary index. So you look at the diet information and score the foods consumed by participants with a positive mark or a negative mark, depending on what the food is. And in this plant-based diet index, healthy plant foods, whole plant foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, vegetable oils, tea and coffee are given a positive mark. Unhealthy plant foods are given a negative mark, so mainly refined carbohydrates, free sugars, sweets and desserts. Now, in this score, potatoes are given a negative mark, and we can perhaps talk about that a little bit later, but it's mainly because the scoring was developed by Harvard researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health, And in all of their studies, which includes the nurses' health study and the health professionals' follow-up study, consuming more potatoes, white potatoes specifically, regardless of the cooking methods, are associated with carrying too much weight, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. Now, we have to realize that this score was not developed amongst participants who are 100% plant-based or vegan. So we can come back to that at the end. And all animal foods are given a negative mark. And so with that, you can create a healthy plant-based index and an unhealthy plant-based index as well. And just to summarize, dozens of studies that now have used this plant-based diet index to really look at the impact of eating healthy plant foods, unhealthy plant foods, and then comparing it to omnivorous diets. The main column to look at is the impact of a healthy plant-based diet on all of these health outcomes, that you have significant reductions in heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, renal failure, fatty liver disease, and the risk of dying. And more recently, we've just found out that a healthy plant-based diet will reduce your risk of severe COVID by 40%. This cancer risk was mainly looked at with the total plant-based diet index rather than dividing it into healthy and unhealthy. And then obviously when you look at the unhealthy plant-based diet index, when you're scoring negatively those less healthy plant foods, you may have a detrimental effect on your health with increased risk of various chronic diseases. And so it's no better than having an omnivorous diet when it comes to human health. And we've had a really good contribution to the literature just in the last few weeks. This large systematic review looking at 141 studies and combining their results and assessing the nutrient intake and status of adults consuming different diet types. So specifically looking at meat eaters, vegetarians, and vegans. And essentially it showed what we already know, in that there are nuances with any diet pattern, and you have to understand these nuances. So, for example, all diets have certain risks of inadequate nutrient intake and certain favorably high levels of intake. And it won't surprise you to know, for example, vegans have lower vitamin B12 intake, long chain fatty acids, and vitamin D, and potentially calcium and iodine, whereas there's favorably high intakes of other healthful nutrients like fiber and various vitamins and folate and magnesium. And you can see each of these diet groups have nuances that people need to be aware of. But overall, the conclusion is that as plant-based diets are generally better for health and the environment, public health strategies should facilitate the transition to a balanced diet with more diverse, nutrient-dense plant foods. So really endorsing what we are advocating for is more plant-based diets for promotion of human health and the co-benefits for the environment. So, moving on to the main part of this talk. We know about the impacts of diet nutrition on human health through different types of studies. And these studies have different quality to them based on the design. And here you can see that there are different numbers of different types of studies that can be conducted. And as you go up this list, they are more robust and considered to be of higher quality. So if we start at the lowest sort of quality, this is when people publish case reports or case series. You know, somebody adopted a plant-based diet and they saw these benefits, and you write up that case in the literature. And obviously there's a risk of only publishing those positive cases. I'm only going to publish a case where somebody showed a benefit. But these are hypothesis generating and can lead to other more robust studies. The next sort of up this hierarchy of quality would be cross-sectional studies and case control studies. And these really just look at populations or cases at a single time point and usually look at the diet that's gone before, so in a retrospective way. So there's various problems with this, and it leads to certain level of bias in the data. These sorts of biases are known as reverse causation or selection bias, or recall bias. So for example, when you're looking at cases and comparing them to control, if you take, for example, bowel cancer, for example, and you get 50 people with bowel cancer, and then you compare them to 50 control subjects who don't have bowel cancer, and you look at the diet that they may or may not have been eating to see whether there's a correlation or association between different foods, it might be that some of the cases of bowel cancer, some of the participants might have chosen to remove processed red meat from the diet because they realize that processed meat is not a good thing when you've got bowel cancer. So actually, when you ask them about their diet at that one point in time, it might come across that eating processed meat wasn't associated with bowel cancer because they've stopped eating it. And so that's what you call reverse causation, when somebody changes their diet based on a diagnosis. And it's sort of the same with cross-sectional studies. You're just looking at one point in time and you don't really know what's gone before and what's gone after. But again, they generate hypotheses for bigger studies. And most of the information we have about plant-based diets come from the analysis of data from prospective cohort studies, where you take a large number of participants who are free from illness at the baseline, and then you follow them for a large number of years. So, 10, 20, 30 years of follow-up, which allow you to assess which exposures, which dietary factors, which environmental exposures, which lifestyle factors are contributing to their future development of chronic conditions like heart disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes. And so examples are studies like the EPIC Oxford study, the Adventist Health study, the Nurses Health study, and the Health Professionals Follow-up study that I'll refer to in the coming slides. But there's still criticisms of these cohort studies, which I'll come back to in a moment. And it's still continued to be thought of as the gold standard to have randomized control studies, but they're really designed for examining individual exposures and are best used for sort of pharmaceutical and drug controlled studies, where you really are only changing one thing. So either a participant is taking a medication or they're not. You can imagine when you're trying to do this in the diet setting, there's so many variables. It's very difficult to change one thing in the diet without another change happening to counterbalance that. And again, I'll come back to that. And then the top quality of study is considered to be systematic reviews or meta-analyses, which bring together a number of similar studies and analyze the data together to really add significance and further weight to the data. And again, there are nuances there that make a meta-analyses difficult to interpret at times, because they are only as good as the data you put in. And if you are putting in studies with heterogeneous populations, you're going to perhaps lead to misinformation, which I'll come to in a minute. So the main criticisms of observational studies like the prospective cohort studies are that there may still be residual confounding. And a confounder is a variable that's associated with both the exposure, meaning something like smoking or consuming meat, and the outcome. So for example, heart disease or cancer, but that confounder is not caused by either, and when accounted for will introduce bias. So another way of looking at it is that, for example, if you're examining the impact of body weight on the risk of heart disease, there may be other factors that contribute to body weight, like diet and exercise and smoking. So if in the group, most of the people who are of normal body weight are smoking, you might come away with the answer being that, well, a normal body weight is associated with an increased risk of heart disease, but it's actually the fact that these people with normal body weight are smokers, and your smoking is a confounder, and that can be controlled for in the statistical analysis, but you need to be aware that it may be a confounder to the data that you're analysing. Another major problem that is often cited with observational studies is that you can't prove causality. It merely shows association, and I'll come back to that. And of course, there may be inaccuracy about collecting the dietary information over time, because it all relies on the person's recall, and that can be of variable quality, and also diets change over time. But you can get over quite a lot of these potential criticisms, specifically by using validated tools to collect dietary information, performing it over and over again. So every 4 years, for example, you might collect the data to make sure it's consistent or whether it's changing. And if you have a large enough cohort, you'll be able to account for these inaccuracies that may occur. So I would like to put to you that observational data can infer causality, and then indeed has done in the past. And this is by applying the Hill criteria that was published in 1965. And it's exactly the criteria used for inferring causality from studies on smoking, to show that smoking causes lung cancer. This criteria has been used to show that trans fat increased the risk of coronary heart disease, and that sugar-sweetened beverages increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. And you have to meet certain criteria. So these include that the strength of the data, that you're getting a strong indication from the data sets that there is a relationship between the exposure and the outcome, that it's consistent, that you're able to show it over and over again, that it's related to the timing of the exposure. So after a set period of time, everyone or most people with that exposure are developing a disease. It's a bit like asbestos exposure. If you follow people long enough, they will develop a complication of that exposure. That there's a dose response, so the more you have of the exposure, the greater the risk of the disease, and that's usually the case for most causal agents. So the more you smoke, the higher the risk of getting lung cancer. The more alcohol you drink, the higher the risk of getting liver cancer or cirrhosis. It has to be plausible, it has to make sense, and it has to make sense based on the knowledge of the natural history and the biology of the disease. And it's always good if you have experimental laboratory-based data that confirm that there's a reason why this exposure would be resulting in an outcome. So being able to show in the laboratory that, for example, processed red meat, the nitrates and nitrites damage the DNA and can lead to oxidative damage, things like that. But actually what people have called for is a change to the way we think about levels of evidence when it comes to lifestyle medicine, because lifestyle medicine interventions don't really fit that same sort of pharmaceutical model of assessing the level of evidence for an exposure or a particular change in your lifestyle. And what David Katz and colleagues has called for is the application of hierarchies of evidence as applied to lifestyle medicine. So HELM it's referred to. And this is developed to assess the strength of evidence relevant to the impact of nutrition and other lifestyle behaviours on health outcomes. And it incorporates a variety of sources of evidence rather than relying on just randomized control studies, and synthesizes this into one rating. And then based on the strength of that rating, you can be reassured that something is associated with the outcome, or that perhaps it is not related to the disease that's developed. And it's interesting to note that there was a Cochrane systematic review in 2014 looking at the different results that might occur in randomized control studies and observational studies. And actually they found that they tended to produce similar effect sizes for a range of health outcomes. So the differences we think that there'll be between randomized control studies and observational studies don't really hold out when you look at the types of data produced. Now, sometimes, of course, we need to reassess our assumptions, and I think we may have to do that with the TMAO hypothesis. So back in 2013, a large analysis was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed us that people consuming the most choline and carnitine from eggs and meat, respectively, synthesized a molecule in their gut called trimethylamine, and that was created by the gut microbes that were present. And when this trimethylamine, so the TMAO, gets absorbed into the body, it gets converted converted to trimethylamine oxide, which then is associated with an increased risk of heart disease, renal failure, type 2 diabetes, and stroke. So we've got this hypothesis that you consume these components from the diet. TMA is made from the gut bacteria, then converted in the liver to TMAO and associated with cardiovascular disease and various other negative health outcomes. But is it really causal? And one way to assess whether something is causal or not is to perform studies called Mendelian randomization. So you're choosing participants with a particular genetic trait. So this was one of the ways used to show that LDL cholesterol is causal in the development of heart disease, because you can find people who've got genetically higher levels of LDL cholesterol. So in a similar way, researchers have looked at people who have a genetically higher predisposition to TMAO levels, and they were unable to show that this genetic predisposition to higher levels of TMAO resulted in negative health outcomes. In addition, we've got data in people eating high levels of fish, and we know that fish is high in TMAO, but fish doesn't lead to negative health outcomes in comparison to other diet patterns that include animal products. Also, whole grains contain betaine, which also increases TMAO. And when studies have looked at diet patterns in those eating fish and whole grains, you can show that there's an increased level of TMAO, maybe not as much as those in heavy meat and egg eaters, but that doesn't in itself predict for an increased risk of chronic disease. So it may be now that we're coming back to an association and reverse causation, that the increase in TMAO is actually caused by the underlying chronic disease. So I think it's just an example where we sometimes need to reassess assumptions, and association may not always be causal. The other issue with the prospective cohort studies is that you can't always correct for confounders, so these variables that may be impacting the end data. And a great example of this is the PURE study, which many of us now think of as being not so pure. It's the prospective urban-rural epidemiological study. And it is a great endeavour because it's really looking at the impact of nutrition on disease in 18 different countries, and specifically recruiting from low, middle and high income countries. Over 100,000 participants, now followed for more than 7 years. And its first publication back in 2017 basically caused doubt about the impact of saturated fat consumption on health outcomes, and instead further demonized the consumption of carbohydrates, a theme that seems to have continued for the last decade or so. So the headline results were that high carbohydrate diets resulted in an increased risk of death, and diets higher in saturated fat, participants had a reduced risk of death. So quite the opposite of what we've learned over the last half a century or so. But when you look at the detail of the participants included and their diets, you can see that high carbohydrate diets, which were predominantly refined carbohydrates, were associated with poverty in low-income countries who were eating a non-diverse diet, mainly of refined grains such as white rice. They had less access to healthcare and had a lower income, whereas saturated fat consumption was really associated with wealth in higher income countries. And that's virtually impossible to control for in such a large study with such a heterogeneous group of participants. In addition, of course, the study in that paper did not distinguish between refined and whole sources of carbohydrates, but their next subsequent study analysis showed that the consumption of fruits, vegetables, and legumes, so whole plant foods, were actually associated with better health outcomes. So it was not easy or possible to correct for these socioeconomic determinants of health. And unless we understand that, we come away with the wrong conclusions. And unfortunately, a lot of people have used the study data from the pure results to really, once again, demonize carbohydrates and advocate for meat-heavy, saturated fat-heavy diet. Now, the gold standard of a randomized study may not be the panacea when it comes to nutrition studies, because we can see how difficult they are. You can't conduct these randomized control studies over decades, and so you have a relatively short follow-up period, which may not be long enough to look at hard outcomes such as people actually developing a heart attack or developing a cancer. So you're often looking for surrogate markers such as blood pressure or cholesterol levels or TMAO levels or so forth. And it's impossible to mask the treatment groups. You're not going to be able to blind yourself to the fact to whether a group of participants are randomized to a plant-based diet or an omnivorous diet, for example. And we know how difficult it is for people to adhere to any assigned dietary diet pattern, and that diets change over time. And unless you're going to literally be delivering the food to the participants, people are going to change their dietary habits based on their social situations, what their family is eating, and that's what's been shown in the studies conducted. If you think about the small studies that have been conducted of a plant-based diet by people like Dr. Dean Ornish, who showed that you could arrest the progression of early stages of prostate cancer, they actually delivered food to the participants 3 times a day, and that's really not going to be possible on a large scale. And these problems have been typified by the Women's Health Initiative study, which was the largest, most expensive nutrition study conducted to date. It recruited almost 50,000 postmenopausal women, and one of the components was a dietary intervention. The women were meant to be lowering their fat intake to less than 20% of energy, and increasing their consumption of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And really the premise was to look at what the health impacts of a low-fat dietary pattern. And their study looking at cardiovascular disease basically concluded that a dietary intervention that reduced total fat and increased intakes of vegetable, fruits, and grains did not significantly reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease in this group. So again, counterintuitive and against everything we know about healthy plant-predominant diets. But when you look at what the participants actually consumed, they didn't actually manage to reduce their fat intake to the predefined endpoint of less than 20 grams per day. Median was 28, meaning that half had higher, half had lower. They managed to increase their fiber intake from 15.4 to 16.9 grams per day. That's hardly anything, and really still only half of what we're meant to be consuming when we're aiming for 30 grams of fiber a day. And they managed to increase their fruit and vegetable consumption from 3.6 to 4.9 grams per day. So you can see if you make these small changes, you're really not going to impact your health to a great degree that's visible in these data. And it just highlights how difficult it is to get people to stick to a diet. And in a similar way, the Predimed study, which is used to reinforce the healthfulness of a Mediterranean diet, also had its problems. Here they did deliver the extra virgin olive oil and nuts to the participants, so at least they were controlling for those variables. But the control arm was meant to be a low-fat control diet. And again, participants didn't meet that requirement of reducing their fat intake to less than 30%. So it wasn't really comparing it to a healthy low-fat diet. And as we know, the study did not show an improvement in mortality. It showed mainly a reduction in the risk of stroke, which was part of the combined analysis, and this was predominantly in the nut group. Now, the Mediterranean diet remains voted the best diet year after year in this January US News and World Report, because it is associated with better outcomes than the standard omnivorous diet, and people enjoy it, and it's easier to stick to than other diet patterns that may have better outcomes. But when you look at the first use of the plant-based diet index, which was initially called the pro-vegetarian score, This was applied to the PREDIMED participants, so nearly 8,000 people, and they looked at the impact of purely a plant-based diet. And the more you adhered to the plant-based diet, the greater the reduction in mortality. So the only way that that study showed an impact on mortality was in those participants eating the most plant foods. And so in summary, the researchers conclude that they provide evidence to support that the simple advice to increase the consumption of plant foods and reduce compensatory animal food sources leads to a survival advantage in this group of individuals who are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So coming back to what we talked about at the start, that plant predominant diets are healthful for heart health specifically. And so what researchers have gone on to do in the last few years, we've had data published on what is now known as the Green Mediterranean diet, developed by Israeli researchers, and using a cohort of people who work at a nuclear facility. And they're generally not very healthy. They have a sedentary job and they're quite a lot of overweight participants. And they've made the Mediterranean diet more green by adding more green plants, so leafy green vegetables. They've added green tea, walnuts, and a strain of duckweed. And also the participants have then compensated by eating very little red meat or poultry. And surprise, surprise, the results of the Green Med study are even better than the traditional Mediterranean diet at controlling for cardiometabolic risk factors, for reducing fatty liver. It has beneficial effects on the hunger hormones. And just recently, a few weeks ago, a publication showing that it also helps protect against age-related brain atrophy, so assuming it will go on to result in less cases of dementia. So all of these references are given here, and I urge you to have a look at this. And again, we finally had a head-to-head comparison with the Mediterranean diet versus a healthy vegan diet. So the Physicians Committee have used their typical low-fat vegan diet, which is whole food plant-based, limiting oils, not including nuts and seeds, and compared it to the PREDIMED type of Mediterranean diet. And they took 62 overweight participants in a 16-week crossover study, meaning that all participants were able to have both diets in a different order. And what they found was that overall, as you might expect, the vegans consumed less calories without actually having any portion control or being asked to consume less calories. And this led to better weight loss, lower cholesterol, improved insulin sensitivity. The only negative against the plant-based diet or the vegan diet was that the impacts on blood pressure was less, and the Mediterranean diet had a greater impact on blood pressure reduction. And we can hypothesize why that might be. The Mediterranean diet was eating nuts and seeds, and we know how good they are for heart health. They also had the olive oil, which is full of the monounsaturated fatty acids, polyphenols, and vitamin E compounds that could have been having a beneficial effect on blood pressure. And when you think about the best diet for heart health, every year for 11 years now, the Ornish diet, which is 100% plant-based, has been tied with the Mediterranean diet, showing you that 100% plant-based diet is effective. It gets negative marks for being difficult to stick to, but I think most of us who've been on a plant-based diet for a while would disagree with that. And in the US, the Ornish program for reversing heart disease, it has been reimbursed by Medicare because the strength of evidence is such that they agree that it's worth reimbursing. So just moving on to some other points about findings from observational data. Just because you find a statistical difference doesn't mean that this is clinically meaningful. And I think for me, 2021 is going to be the year when vegan diets for children got really bad press. It seemed that every other month there was a story trying to put us off raising plant-based children. And this particular one was really quite annoying because although the vegan children in this group of Polish children were about 1 to 3 centimeters shorter, they were still within their normal expected range for height. And just because there was a statistical difference doesn't mean that these children are going to suffer in any way, and they are still growing within the expected centiles for their age group. And of course, you know, as expected, the vegan children had a healthier cardiovascular risk profile, which we know will predict for better heart health later on in life. And the children were not meeting quite a lot of their nutrient requirements. And so it didn't really tell us much about a good quality, well-planned diet. But nonetheless, even if children are shorter, usually because they're not consuming dairy, which is associated with accelerated growth, this doesn't mean that they're going to be shorter than expected for their genetic height. The other key message is read all the data in the paper itself, in the supplementary data, but also you need to read around the subject to know whether the data is consistent with the rest of the literature. And one example of this is the study that recently came out on bone health in participants of the EPIC Oxford study. It showed that those who were not eating meat had a higher risk of fracture, and this was greatest in the vegan cohort. And so vegans had about a 43% increased risk of developing any fracture, and a rather higher risk of developing hip fractures, which is usually considered a fragility fracture and related to osteoporosis. But when you delve into the data a bit more deeply, you realize that this is only in women with a lower BMI, and quite a lot of the vegans in the EPIC Oxford were bordering on underweight, that the data wasn't correlated with vitamin D levels, and we know from prior analysis that both vitamin D and B12 levels were low in vegans who were not adequately supplementing. And we know from this data that the cause of the fractures are not known, but that's of less relevance. It was key to note that it's mainly associated with women and those of lower body mass index. And then when you put it together with the other data set from the Adventist Health Study, again, vegans do have an increased signal for developing hip fractures, but that risk completely disappears when you're adequately obtaining enough calcium and vitamin D. So it comes back to being well planned, not being complacent, but making sure you are getting the nutrients you require, and in the context of a healthy lifestyle with adequate physical activity, both aerobic and resistance exercises. Now, moving on to meta-analysis, which are sort of revered as the best quality data. The data is only good as that which is included in the analysis. And so it can lead to misinformation when the data is not adequately analysed and when you have heterogeneous populations included. So an example is two meta-analyses, one from 2010 and one from 2014, basically coming up with conclusions that the consumption of saturated fat is not associated with heart disease. And Time magazine published the front cover saying, "Eat butter." But what was key here, it was that the analysis did not take into account what's replacing saturated fat. And most participants here, if they had lower saturated fat intake, were replacing it with refined carbohydrates, which we know are not going to improve your heart health. They had insufficient participants with lower intakes of saturated fat, although they did include one vegetarian cohort, the Oxford vegetarian cohort. They gave that study less statistical weight than other studies where there wasn't a big enough difference between the saturated fat content in participants. So if you go from saturated fat consumption of 18% to 15%, you're not going to see a significant difference in heart health outcomes. And so what the analysis really showed was that substituting fat for refined carbohydrates is equally detrimental for heart health, and that the participants hadn't made a big enough change to their saturated fat intake. Whereas in contrast, when you have robust data that's really looking at the issue of instead of what and performing substitution analysis, and this is large analysis from over 200,000 participants in the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, you can see that if your main source of fat is saturated fat, you have a linear increase in the risk of death, particularly from cardiovascular causes. Sorry, the saturated fat is the red line. The blue line, which is even worse, is trans fats. But when you swap it for monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, as the percentage increases in the diet, you reduce your risk of death by around 25%. And if you look at these forest plots, anything to the left is better and anything to the right is worse. That's the left and right of the midline. When you substitute saturated fat for any plant sources of fat, there is a reduction in the development of risk of death, cardiovascular mortality, cancer mortality, and even dementia. But the only thing that is worse than saturated fat is trans fats, and that's to the right for most of these cases. So again, it comes back to, instead of what, you can't just exclude one nutrient and not analyze what is being substituted. And we know, when you look at robust analysis, that the Cochrane review continues to show that reducing saturated fat over the longer term is beneficial. And that's key as well, because it's the long-term impact of reducing saturated fat intake, which lowers LDL cholesterol, and that the greater the reduction, the greater the benefit. And that's the key in the meta-analysis. The difference between the population and the participants were not big enough. So the other key thing that we're all aware of is to be mindful of industry influence, because we know that the meat, dairy, egg industry, and even the olive oil and nut industry fund research. They pay scientists to do the research, and even give money to good causes, such as physical activity for children, and try and really sort of change the narrative about their foods, which are not contributing to our health in a good way. And when Dr. Barnard from PCRM and colleagues looked at the impact of industry funding on cholesterol research, they particularly looked at the science on egg consumption. And in this analysis, they found that regardless of whether the egg industry had funded the study or not, virtually all studies showed that egg consumption increased cholesterol levels in the blood. However, it was less common for the industry-funded interventions to actually report these study findings, and their conclusions were discordant with the actual results. And we know that just a minimal reduction, just in 1 millimole per litre of LDL cholesterol reduction, can have a massive impact on your reduction in cardiovascular events, around 20% reduction. And so there was misinformation here, with the conclusions not actually being in line with the data. So then you might say, well, how do we know that olive oil is healthy, or how do we know that nuts are healthy? I think you have to have an open mind and be mindful of the study design. So, for example, there really is a study out there that compared almond consumption with pork consumption, and really it's not going to take rocket science to realize that almonds are going to be better for your health than pork. You need to look at the credibility of the researcher's institution, consistency of data across the board and all the different types of studies. You need to think, well, are the nutrients in nuts health promoting? We know it has unsaturated fatty acids. We know there's lots of fiber in nuts. There's vitamin E and other vitamins that we know are healthy. So it makes sense. And we've got collaborative mechanistic laboratory and intervention studies that also show the same thing. So we have to do the best we can, and we're never going to be able to get rid of all industry funding. And then the final interpretation may not reflect the study data. And so this was the case here with 5 papers published in 2019 that really suggested that red meat was fine to consume. And it was published by a group of 14 international researchers who, by the way, were paid by the meat industry, that brought out 5 systematic reviews and said, well, the strength of evidence is not so great, and so we shouldn't worry about any potential harms from red meat consumption. What they actually only looked at was that if you limit the red meat consumption to 3 portions a week. They didn't include any vegetarian or vegan cohorts that don't eat any red or processed meats. And they gave considerable weight to people's attitudes, and they concluded that omnivores enjoy eating meat and consider it essential, and therefore asking them to reduce consumption is not a good way of issuing public health guidelines. But actually, when you look at the data, all of their data was consistent with what was previously published, and that reducing processed red and red meat consumption led to a reduction in all of these health outcomes. And even on an individual level, if the impact is small, we know that a 10% reduction in cardiovascular mortality is going to have a huge impact at a population and societal level. And we also know from recent data that just red meat consumption, not even processed red meat consumption leads to over 800,000 deaths per year. And the study failed to assess the impact on the environment. And we know now that we can't deal with our diet choices without thinking about the impact on climate and ecological health. And the largest analysis to date from nearly 500,000 participants in the EPIC study has shown that if we were to eat as per the recommendations of the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Plate, which allows for merely 1 portion of red meat a week, we could reduce the risk of dying from all causes by around 60% and reduce up to 40% of all cancers. This Planetary Health Plate is predominantly plant-based. And sometimes we don't have the precise answer, and I think this applies to the whole olive oil debate, which I think is a little divisive in our plant-based community. As a group, we are fine with people who want to include good quality oils in their diet, and we're fine if people don't want to. I think it does come down to a personal choice. And this debate has been discussed again because there's been 2 large studies published that show that the consumption of olive oil, particularly when you're comparing it to other sources of fat, such as dairy fat, butter, and other animal sources of fat, does reduce your risk of various illnesses and the risk of dying from neurovascular disease, respiratory disease, and so forth. And this meta-analysis showed that olive oil intake reduced the risk of certain cancers. But again, it's all about instead of what. And none of these studies have shown that olive oil is better than any other type of vegetable oil. And there's no examination of the impact of olive oil added to a healthy whole food plant-based diet. That study has not been done. But what David Katz has done is look at the effects of different quality different quality olive oil in 20 participants who were deemed at high risk of type 2 diabetes, and they were either given olive oil in a smoothie, 50 mils of a smoothie, either extra virgin olive oil or refined olive oil. And the extra virgin olive oil actually did improve endothelial function, whereas the refined olive oil didn't. So it comes back to quality of the oils, and if you are going to use added oils, an extra virgin olive oil or a high quality canola oil is the way forward. So I hope I've given you some pointers to how to look and analyse these nutrition studies, and that observational data can infer causality, but you can't always adjust for all confounders. Randomized studies in nutrition are not going to be the be-all and end-all. Meta-analyses are only as good as the data included. Just because you've got a statistical significant p-value doesn't mean that this is clinically significant to a population. You've got to read all the data and not rely just on the author's conclusions. Always be aware of industry influence. And there may be issues that we don't have all the answers for, and we have to do the best we can with the available data. So just a reminder of the course I run and co-facilitate with Leila Dagan at Winchester University. There's places available for the rest of the year, so do check it out. We go into all of these issues in more detail. And as Rahini says, some of these topics have been discussed further in my book, co-authored with my sister. And some of you will know I write a weekly update that discusses the latest science. Thanks very much.
That was incredible, Shireen. I really struggled with the Q&A because honestly, every single question that has come up is answered in your book. But I will take, I've got a couple that I really had to scrounge for them, because you have done such a comprehensive deep dive into all of these topics. But one that's come up is and it's been upvoted by a few people, is there one particular paper that you like to cite to patients and scientists that are still ignorant of the benefits of a whole food plant-based style of eating and support a ketogenic diet instead? So is there one that stands?
It's always difficult just to pick one, isn't it? Because as I say, you have to synthesize all the data, but maybe I'll stick with two, and perhaps we can send them around in the email that follows. So one is a metabolic ward experiment done by Kevin Hall from the NIH, and these metabolic ward studies are really robust ways of looking at the impact of changes in diet on our actual physiology. And he literally did the study that we all wanted him to do, which was a plant-based diet versus an animal-based keto diet, and looked at the changes that were occurring in those participants in a really robust way. And the expected outcomes occurred. The ketogenic diet led to increased insulin resistance, increased LDL cholesterol, and didn't impact body weight in a desirable way. Whereas the plant-based diet, people ate less calories, improved their body weight, improved LDL cholesterol, etc. And then there's been a large sort of analysis, so a meta-analysis looking at the low-carb dietary pattern in prospective cohort studies, bringing all that information together. It was published in the European Nutrition Journal, and that basically showed that centering your diets around animal foods was detrimental to heart health, increased the risk of cancer, and increased your risk of death. So those are the two papers I would quote, I think.
We'll include them in the email that we send everyone. I'm just going to launch a quick poll to get your feedback on the talk as well. There's been lots of questions about olive oil, which I would urge you again to have a look at the book, because it's really explored in detail and referenced. And there's even a great little section at the back which has all the abbreviations, because sometimes all these clinical, like the nutrition papers, we do use a lot of acronyms, EVO for extra virgin olive oil and things. If you're not familiar, it's difficult. And we've had loads of lovely comments, Shireen. There's someone, or a few people joining from Australia. I think it's about 4 a.m. there, so that's pretty incredible. And someone's asked about the best papers to show doctors who refuse to consider I would buy them the book, or have a look at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK website, because Shireen does weekly roundups of all the latest science, so it's really up to date, and as well as the end of year roundup, so you can always go and look at that. But if you sign up to our newsletter, you will get updates regularly as well. So two nutrition style questions that came up. One was about potatoes, which you highlighted when you talked about the plant-based dietary index. What are your views on potatoes? Because that seems to be a question that people have, and doctors seem to be quite supportive of eating potatoes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just, once again, to reiterate, this kind of scoring system is developed amongst or from the diet data from omnivores. So, we have to keep that in mind. And in an omnivorous diet, when perhaps the variety of plant foods is not so robust as a whole food plant-based diet, potatoes somehow come out less favourable. I have no problems with eating potatoes, and obviously different coloured potatoes are all fine. But I think you need to concentrate on variety, and a variety of grains, a variety of vegetables, a variety of starchy vegetables too. But Rahina, you give your clients great information on how to reduce the glycemic index of potatoes, which is one of the concerns anyway.
Yeah, I think, if you're generally, the way that you would eat potatoes in a whole food plant-based diet, of potentially baking them or steaming potatoes and having them with the skin, which by the way contains 90% of the potassium value in a potato, it's really important to have the skin, and that's where a lot of the fibre and the other micronutrients are as well. You probably pair that with something like baked beans or a bean chili or hummus and a salad. So it's not so much of a problem, but certainly cooling them, so refrigerating them and then taking them out and either eating them cold in a potato salad or something, or reheating them actually significantly decreases the starch content and decreases the glycemic index as well. So that's really helpful for people who do have issues with insulin resistance and things like that as well. But and it increases the resistant starch. But I wouldn't get too hung up on that. You know, really, it's how you don't want to fry them or roast them, ideally, if possible. So yeah, I would definitely support eating them, just varying your diet as much as possible. Dark chocolate has come up. So the dark chocolate with high cocoa solids content of over 70%, is it recommended? And what are your views on that?
Yeah, I think there's no problem eating dark chocolate. The darker the better. I managed to get myself up to 90% finally after many months of trying. And, you know, saturated fat isn't just one content, one compound, is it? There's a number of different saturated fats, and the stearic acid in dark chocolate doesn't seem to have any adverse effect on LDL cholesterol, and there seems to be some benefit to endothelial health from the dark chocolate. I think the problems come, obviously, as we all know, when it's full of sugar and various other things that accompany chocolate. So in small amounts, I have no problem. I even think Michael Clapper says he eats some dark chocolate now and again, doesn't he?
Yeah, I would say that I think a lot of chocolate companies have been keen to kind of market it as having this health halo, and dark chocolate, it's a treat. I wouldn't call it a health food. And if you are, you know, very sensitive to sugar, then potentially having something that's a bit more unprocessed, like cacao nibs or cacao powder, which is full of antioxidants and flavonols, and that's the heart healthy compounds in chocolate, although it does also have magnesium and other things as well. So again, aiming for that high cocoa solids. There's a really good trial going on now. The paper is due to come out anytime now. It's called the Cosmos trial. I think they're looking at 21,000 people. It's by the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and it's been going on for a while, but they're going to identify the impact of cocoa extract on cardiovascular health. Because but yeah, I would obviously take what you hear from chocolate companies with a pinch of salt, but as treats go, I think it's a good one to have a couple of squares a day if you enjoy it. But if you're sensitive to caffeine, probably not having it close to bedtime is a good idea as well, because it does have a higher caffeine content. Okay, so there's some more questions that have come in, but I think unfortunately we're out of time. We have loads of questions for people who want to know more, and I would urge you to sign up for the next Winchester University diploma. Shireen, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about when that is running next?
Yeah, so we've just started a cohort, but the next sign up is for beginning of April. I haven't got the date in the top of my head, but I think the first week of April and then again in June, and that really is facilitated, so you get access to myself and Layla on a daily basis to ask your questions and what have you, and go through much of this information in detail. So you'll get a certificate of completion, so it's a bit like the eCornell. You get a certificate with CPD points if that's relevant to your work and your appraisal. And then we are doing regular study update days, so twice a year now you get to come back for half a day to get an update, because there's so much new science. And I would encourage you just to sign up to my Medium account and just get my weekly updates. It's just a way of keeping up to date, and I do repetitively go through the same sort of questions and topics.